Well, I'm sorry to say that we're the last presentation before we enter the final keynote of the conference. It's been a lovely conference. My name is Abigale Stangl, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Colorado.
And I'm Ann Cunningham. I teach art at the Colorado Center for the Blind, and I'm also a tactile artist.
So we've come together to present to you a collaborative project that we've been working on. I am a design researcher, and I'm interested in digital fabrication, but more importantly, how we can involve people who are blind and visually impaired in making their own art, and thinking about the process of building up one's confidence and sense of agency through the design process.
So I've been teaching at the Colorado Center since the late 90s, and I'm very interested in encouraging the students to explore their sense of artistic expression. And so when Abby and I met, it was a nice collaboration that we came up with.
And on this slide, we have an image of us both working with a participant. I'm working with a young woman or young child and her mother, feeling a 3D printed prototype.
And I'm in class. I'm working with a student, and we're discussing how he's going to glaze his cup.
So we want to tell you first about the setting for this research that we are presenting. It's the Colorado Center for the Blind, which is it's a rehabilitation training center under the National Federation of the Blind. And oftentimes students 18 years of age and older will come to the center to have independence training for 6 to 9 months, and where they're really focusing on building their skills to independence. There's a series of 4 images here where one student is hitting a boxing mat, another student is working in a wood room with a saw. Another student is working with a computer to learn some tech skills, and there are then 3 students standing on a subway platform learning orientation and mobility.
Over the years, we've discovered a number of different real good reasons to work with art. Number one, it really encourages people to feel that they can do more than they thought they could. So many people come and they end up in art class, and they've frequently expressed to me that they thought art was something that they were never going to do again since they went blind, and they were really excited to think that there are possibilities. But also we've noticed that it really helps with spatial awareness. When we work with maps, we work with drawing, and I've been working into perspective, and we'll see where that goes. But it's all, we just keep trying to push the edge of the envelope in this program.
So we've just pulled up an image here of 4 hands working together. 2 of them, I believe, are Anne's hands, and 2 of them are a student's hands. There's a stone file, as well as clay and a paintbrush and glaze on clay. And so this image represents this multimedia approach where it's really embodied and guided when necessary.
Right. We've come up with, we try everything, and I try to be really sensitive to how the student likes to work, so that we create a working arrangement so that the student's comfortable while I'm guiding them. Yeah.
So with this premise of Anne teaching art at the Colorado Center for the Blind, and this goal of really broadening these students' engagement in art making and viewing, we set to teach an 8-week course where we were meeting with the students once a week for 4 hours. And we really wanted to work with them to address that there haven't been a lot of opportunities for them to be making art. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our participants' experience with art prior to coming to this class in a few minutes. But also that, from a research perspective, there's a lot of really amazing practical experience in this room, let alone in other communities of people working with students, but trying to find a way to record and document and research that so that we can disseminate it and look at some of these strategies a little bit more systematically. That was kind of the goal of this collaboration as well. And so as we were brainstorming around how we could do this, we decided a few things. That we wanted to work with the students to make a multimodal composition, meaning that they would work with multiple materials and multiple senses to be designing a product. And we wanted the process to be guided by the students' interests, and we wanted it to be kind of native to the Colorado Center for the Blind classroom, where it was this open studio idea where they could come in and they could make. But we also needed to make sure that it was guided so that they could feel that there was some structure and that we had a concept that we are all working towards. And so we were coming into this experience with an idea of universal design for learning, but also understanding that there would be times when we needed to have differentiated instruction with the different students based off of their abilities and interests.
One of the things that I've always noticed that at the Colorado Center is when I get a new class in, I always ask them, why are we bothering with art? Why? It's a lot of work. Why bother? And so we start talking about what we can get out of art. And I see art as tactile graphics and tactile art, all as two sides of the same coin. So I don't differentiate between the value of either. And but what always rises to the top is the ability to express themselves. So this project really fed that whole idea and a drive in the students.
So we were designing this 8-week curriculum where, again, the goals were to work with them to develop new perspectives and confidences, to be learning some information design strategies like abstraction and decoding and different ideas in terms of how things are represented, and then also a product focus so that they had something that they could really be proud of making. And then also, finally, kind of in the designerly sense, engage them in an ongoing reflection so that they could then be thinking about their own role and their own identity as their identity work as an artist in this setting. Through each week, we had a series of ongoing activities that we really focused on involving them in, always going to hands-on exploration, participating in group discussion, practicing their spatial orientation, getting to know their way around the room, around art supplies stores, around tactile art museums, so that they were finding themselves in these different environments where, as art makers and art patrons, we are involved in the community. And also to be asking questions of the facilitators, of each other, and to be really learning in this social experience. And one of the things is that many of these students are coming from all over the country to be at this center. And so it's this very intense kind of socio-cultural experience where they are making new friends. For many of the younger students, it's the first time they've been away from home. And so we were also aware of what was going to be happening in this art room, where most of their other courses were very structured, were again about these core skill sets to be able to live independently, where this is a space where there was more freedom to be exploring. We also wanted to look at how were they working with these tools to mediate their experience. And we'll tell you a little bit about some of the students' experiences with learning about how to make art through engaging their body. Just in the sake of time, we had several research questions guiding this research, but I'd rather go on by telling you that we had 5 main participants that we worked with. They were a range of ages from 19. There were 2 19-year-olds, a 20-year-old, a 36-year-old, and a 66-year-old. And they were all coming to the center with different levels of visual impairment and blindness. And so we had 3 students or participants that had acquired blindness and 2 that were born totally blind. And there's a lot of text on this slide, and I'm definitely not going to read it all, but the point is to show that because we have their reflections and this information, we saw how they were identifying as artists in the beginning. And only one of them really identified as somebody who was crafty and had a lot of experience in that, with that, and she was a participant that had become blind 2 years before.
I would like to point out, though, that everyone, no matter where their level of blindness is at this point, they're all working under sleep shades. All the students attend classes under sleep shades. So it makes it a lot easier because we're all in the same boat.
So every week we had a plan, and then when we got into the classroom, of course, we iterated upon it and were responsive to the students' needs and interests. So for the next slides here, we're going to walk you through kind of the series of activities that we did, and then some of the findings that we've started to identify in our analysis. There's an image here of one of the students who is walking through an interactive installation that Anne created while we were trying to work with them to identify what kind of product would we want to make. And it was for the story Little Red Riding Hood.
Right, right. And so we were talking about we could do illustrations, we could do drawings, we could do collage, we could do small sculptures, and then we could also create an environment. And so for this, just for a short experience, I took rocks, that's alabaster that we use for stone carving, and I made a little pathway, and then I grabbed some trees, branches outside, and just walked along with the students, and it was really pretty effective.
We had spikes, we had claws on the fingers,
oh, right.
And so they would
somebody was clawing the wolf along the path, and it was but it was a good experience. I mean, it really worked. So
the first week was really about introducing them to clay, showing them art, reading them some stories, to start thinking about these different components that would be involved in the design work. And so we were getting to know the participants, and the first week we really started to see their kind of social orientation to one another. One participant was really interested in the defining the task and moving forward and keeping everybody else in the group on task. Another person was really focused on the task, but she was really more reflective about her own analytical position, and she wasn't somebody that was very confident as an artist, so she was relying back on her other competencies. Another participant was really looking to complement the group's work but didn't really take the lead. And so we were starting to recognize that there really were multiple pathways that we wanted to be using to engage these students. So then in the second week, we went to the Colorado Springs Fine Art Museum, which is a large gallery with about 300 revolving tactile art pieces. I think it's the only museum in Colorado that has art that's accessible. And so we brought these students there, and we worked with them to become viewers and interpreters of these sculptures. And there's a technique that Anne has been using that helps that process, if you want to describe it.
It's hard to describe because when you get a little practice with it, it comes across better. But what it is it's 3 questions. First, we ask the students to examine the piece of artwork and just name everything they can name. So they're exploring it, and they're at the Colorado Springs Fine Art Center. They're actually exploring the artwork, and it's not a tactile interpretation of the artwork. So it's original, and they're exploring it, and they name everything. Once they've named everything, we ask, what if something were different? Say the sculpture suddenly went from this hand size to room size. All of a sudden, it would be so different. It would be inaccessible for one thing, because anything that's out of reach is inaccessible. And it would be like overwhelming. And so, but it's not that way. So because it's not that way, it says that the artist wanted you to be able to access this piece. And so we're just, it's a technique to invite the students in, because the questions, when they come up with a what if, it's always self-generated. So it's always cluing you into what it is that's interesting them. And so then it pulls them in even more when they answer the question themselves.
So we then broke the students into 2 different groups based off of their prior experience and their interests, and led them through kind of a guided questioning around each piece so that they developed a relationship with that artwork. And then we worked with them to then make some sketches of their emotions in this environment so that then they were becoming comfortable with using a pen and paper. So again, we're trying to involve them in using multiple means of creating and being able to, this recognition of manipulating their environment. One thing to note that at the end of this activity, we all engaged in a group reflection. And this was we got the feedback after reflecting together about the experience and what pieces they were really interested in and why they're interested in those pieces, that they had never in this learning environment, in the center, had the opportunity to reflect and think about their own learning. And so this was something that obviously became an important part of this curriculum, is coming into that kind of meta reflection of who we are as artists and people who can manipulate material in this world. So then the 3rd week we came back to the Colorado Center for the Blind, and we focused on developing a story together. And there were several participants who had kind of more active roles in doing this, but they had the group identified 3 pieces from the museum that they wanted to create a story around. And so this was something that we did not lead. We came in prepared with some stories that we could retell through different modalities, but they were then reflecting on the pieces, and there were 3 pieces. One was a lion, one was a ram dancer, which is a Native American, of a man holding bells and dancing with his legs up in the air. And then the other sculpture was a more abstract piece that was of wind. And so we walked through and told the story together. So we did this in a round robin way, where one person started, the next person added to it, and then at the end we read it back and we did one round of refinement together. And this worked very well for the creation. So this is us kind of co-creating the story. For those who can see this image, it is of the ram dancer that I was just describing. Again, it's a man with ram horns on his head. His 2 hands are holding 2 stalks, and his legs have bells on them, and he's in a moving, dancing position.
He is also, the artist is Michael Naranjo. He happens to be a Native American blind artist.
And so on the 4th week, once we had this story, we then went to a local community college who had a bunch of materials, carpets, textiles, different things actually for interior decorating, but they were a partner on this project, where the students then came and identified and selected the materials for their art project. And this was an interesting experience because we thought that we were going to go and we would they would identify the materials right away, but they were really focused on refining their story and going back to the auditory, the language-based modality of this design project. So even into week 5, which we'll talk about in a minute, there was a lot of iteration and wanting to come back to refining this story in a way that was very collaborative.
I've found that stories come up over and over again when I'm taking people on tours of museums, or pretty much in any situation where we have time and we're talking with one another about art and stuff like that. People start telling stories, so it's really big part of that.
Yeah. So this is another slide that's full of text, and I definitely don't want us to read it, but it's, again, representative of us collecting this information and data around some of these conversations and the negotiations that are happening between the participants. And here we're starting to see that there's some identity work here. Well, first of all, it turns out that not everybody in the room really had an understanding of what a lion was. And so we had to take a step back and make sure that we were together creating a common reference and a common representation of that lion. But then you start to see in the story narrative, there's some conversation about the lion in one instance of the story being called one thing, but in another instance of the story being another thing. And so there's a conversation and saying, well, if somebody's never seen him before, how would they know? And so they're bringing in their own experience into this story and using that experience to situate the characters in this story. So in the 5th week, we started to really refine the tactile art making, using clay, using these different materials. And we actually had a kind of a breakdown during this week, which was good. It was good for us as facilitators, learning how to engage these students in this process. Again, different students had different interests and different focuses within this process, and some of them wanted more direction than others did, and there was a deep tension around the story narrative and how to keep on refining it versus getting their hands on the art. And so it was this moment where we as facilitators had to negotiate that.
Well, one of the things that I think came up was that students were taking on different identities. Certain students were focusing more on the ram dancer, and others were focusing more on the lion. And so they were coming at the story with those identities, and they didn't necessarily match up. The ram dancer saying, "What's this curious creature?" Well, the lion knows what he is. So there was this conflict that they had to negotiate.
So the final version of the story was that this ram dancer was this lion was born in Africa, but he was lost and alone, and his family didn't like him, and his hair was matted, and he was so uncomfortable. And so he set out on this journey to go find his destiny. And again, there's a parallel here, I think, for some of these students coming to the center, kind of exploring, and some of they reflected on that as well. And then he comes to the Arizona desert. Somehow he magically appears in the Arizona desert, which is a kind of different environment. And he's standing on a hill, and he sees a dancing party of these Native Americans dancing around a fire. And he slowly approaches the ram dancer, and the ram dancer and him become friends. And then all of a sudden a rainstorm comes, and it washes away the mats in his hair, the collar around his neck, and he has found his home and his destiny, and a true notion of friendship and being. And so through this process of making this work with the students, we as facilitators developed strategies based off of the students' interests. Some of them really wanted to work independently, some of them really wanted to work socially and co-design with us, and others who had less experience with working with material needed really guided instruction. For example, with Robert, you used several interesting strategies.
Right. Well, Robert had really started working with one of our co-facilitators, and they created this nice dynamic where he's a very verbal guy. He's an actor, and he could describe things vividly. And she was very facile at helping him manifest these things. But then one week she was out, and he was like sort of dead in the water that week. And so I went over to him and I said, what do we need to accomplish this week? And he said, well, and he started explaining everything. And so, great. I said, but he didn't know what a lion was at this point. And so fortunately somebody else had made a lion. And so I said, well, here's this lion. And I showed him that, and then I said, but what position is your lion in? And so we started exploring, because he is an actor, and I said, you know, how would he be feeling at this point in the story? So he started assuming that position, and then he was able to pick up, using the model and using his body knowledge, he was able to complete the task.
And these are two images that these are two images of the products that he made. One is of 4 figures around a fireplace made out of clay and fabric and sculpture, and then the other is a drawing that he did, a raised line drawing that is representative of the sculpture that he made. So we have just 1 minute, and we're going to show you the final products, if we may. There are 4 panels. This is the panel where Spiky the lion is leaving his home in the jungle. There are a lot of lions that are deep in the jungle under leaves, and Spiky is a clay sculpture looking back. This is a sand pit with a bunch of figurines in it, standing around the fire, where Spiky the lion is standing on a mound looking at the fire. This is an image of Spiky, the head of the lion, with big tasseled hair and the collar that was once around his neck broken with a foam cloud. And finally, we have this friendship and the freedom of being under the night stars. So thank you all, and we hope that you will engage your students in art practice.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it was a good ending of the session. It was very lively, and it was nice to see. It's a shame that you didn't bring the tactile material. It could be of interest to see, to exhibit here. Questions, comments? Everyone looks a little bit pale and tired. Yes, one question.
This program, is it possible to license the thing that you do and repeat the same thing, or style like a Colorado school in Lublin, for example, how we could do the same?
So I'm working on my PhD, and that's part of what I'm wanting to do, is to run this multiple times, to identify with Anne some of these strategies based, and it's very, looking at different variations, whether it's kind of this narrative fiction story based, or whether it's about science communication and using multiple modalities to think about how do we express our observations about the world in different ways. So please stay tuned, because that is the goal of this. It's educational research, and it's called design-based implementation research, where we're looking at what changes between the sessions with the students.
And how much do you think that you influence the students in the way how they express themselves?
That's a good question.
I think we influence them a great deal, because we've got we hold all the cards. We are offering the materials, we're offering the experience. So yes, there's a great deal of influence, but I do think that we are also encouraging the students to take the lead wherever they can, so that they start to own this skill. And I always try to let them know where they can buy more materials. If they get into one material, I start talking to them about where they can purchase these things. So after they leave, they don't have to leave the practice.
And I would say, as reflective practitioners, right? I mean, I'm sighted, and there's so much learning that I personally had, and I'm sure many of us are learning about these intercultural and cross-cultural relationships, and I think that is equally important, and that's something that I hope to share as well.
It should be of interest, I think, at least, to set up some kind of workshop in different parts of the world with different workshops leaders to see if we will receive different results or not, or if it's.
I'm game. Let me know if anybody wants to collaborate. We should.
More questions, comments?
Fika.
Fika.